Okay, this is the first video on the practices of the Spanish Civil War, 36 to 39. You've got there where I got my notes from. Let's go ahead and get started. So the war began on July 17, 1936, with the general's coup and uprising across Spain. In areas that were pro-monarchy and pro-conservatism, the generals found it was a pretty easy time securing support and claiming the local government. That mostly meant the agrarian areas like in the northwest. In areas that were more pro-Republican or at least pro-decentralization, there was a much tougher battle. This included the northern coastline and southern Spain, especially that valuable Mediterranean coast. By the end of the coup and the start of the Civil War, Republican Spain had managed to hold on to industrial areas like that strip there in the north where Asturias is, and in particular the sort of capital of that region, Bilbao in the Basque, which had important iron and steel works. In addition to that, they had also held on to the two major cities of Madrid and Barcelona, which each contained over 1 million people. By contrast, the rebels only had one city, Seville. To make matters worse for the nationalist rebels, General Sanjurjo had died in a plane crash July 20th, 1936, shortly after the coup. General Francisco Franco was in Morocco to take command of the Army of Africa, but had remained stranded there as most of the Spanish Navy had remained loyal to the government, and thus his Army of Africa couldn't actually get into Spain. And the Falangist leader, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, was in prison at the time of the uprising. So even though in some ways they had an upper hand in July of 1936, the Republican government was also experiencing its own set of issues. Leftist trade unions and parties were angry because they felt that the government had just let a third of the country be taken over by nationalist rebels. They were demanding arms then from the government to just let them go fight and reclaim the country from these conservatives. In the face of that pressure, Prime Minister Quiroga resigned on July 18th. President Manuel Azaña then gave the position to Diego Barrio. Barrio attempted to compromise with the rebels, but after being told in a phone call by General Mola that there would be no negotiations, no compromise, no conditions for surrender, Barrio decided to resign one day after his appointment. Barcelona, though, was an example of a Republican-held city that was well within the boundaries of safety regarding its position. It was both surrounded by Republican territory and had easy access to France to get supplies, and it had access to the ocean, which was still under Republican naval control. It was so safe in Barcelona that 20,000 anarchists, communists, and others actually left the city right after the coup to go west towards Aragon to help out there and possibly kickstart a people's revolution. The capital city of Madrid was a different story. It did have Republican territories to the south, but to the north and west it was surrounded by nationalist-held areas. When the coup began, women and men had grabbed rifles, commandeered taxis, and set up a front in the north against the oncoming nationalist forces they surely thought were coming. They improvised militia groups. They tended to adopt the workers' look of overalls and dungarees instead of military fatigues, and organized these sort of ragtag militias that were equipped with a motley collection of weapons, including armor from the Middle Ages and harquebuses and pikes. General Mola did send a force of about 1,000 south from Navarre, coming from the sort of northeast part of this map, towards Madrid to take it. However, when the troops got close to Madrid, they were stopped by fierce Republican resistance from those militias, as well as the fact that they were running low on ammunition. This is when the new Prime Minister, Guerral, made a pretty fateful decision that really escalated things in the Spanish Civil War. The new Prime Minister, Jose Guerral, decided to go ahead and concede to the militias and made the fateful decision to arm them. So the military began passing out weaponry to the anarchist and socialist groups in Madrid. This meant that individuals and groups, various groups including things like the Union, their UGT, now had their own weapons and could take matters into their own hands, which in some ways took power from the state, making it so that the government had even less control in this increasingly chaotic situation. One of the first targets of the newly armed militias of Madrid was the Montana barracks in Madrid, where General Fanjul was trapped inside. He responded by firing on the crowds, refusing to submit, but eventually the garrison was overwhelmed after several hundred deaths, and Madrid remained Republican. In heavily Republican Barcelona, the rebel plan had been for the various rebel military officers and troops to gather in the town center and take the city over from there. The president of Catalonia, which is where Barcelona is located, it's a city in Catalonia, refused to arm people like they had done in Madrid, and instead what happened was several loyal civil guards decided to go ahead and pass out guns and ammunition to anarchists regardless of what the president of Catalonia was saying. So anarchist militias and loyal civil guards were armed. They stopped the nationalist gathering from happening. 500 people died in that battle, and one of the generals, General Godet, was actually captured during this battle and killed in August after a quick trial. So the people are armed now in Madrid and Barcelona, the militias, and we start to see the war really escalate. In the religious city of Toledo, Republicans began a siege of the military academy Alcazar there in July of 1936. Colonel Jose Moscardo led his troop of 1,100 soldiers in defense of the building against the leftist forces. All day during 70 days, from July to September, Republicans bombed and fired at the building in what became a symbolic defense and show of stamina for the nationalists. Inside the building, 100 left-wing hostages were executed by Moscardo during the 70-day resistance. The nationalists in Alcazar soon ran out of food and were eating mule stew and drinking stagnant water. They smoked rose petals and mulberry bush leaves. Republicans threw packs of cigarettes over the wall with Republican propaganda on them. Disease was common. 550 women and children were huddled inside the catacombs of Alcazar. Doctors amputated limbs with meat saws, but they would continue their struggle for the months to come in a symbolic defense. More on that later. As the war took shape, the brutality and cruelty of both sides became evident in retribution attacks and killings. In areas controlled by nationalist rebels, trade union members, members of left-wing parties, etc. were executed. This was justified by saying that they were simply trying to stop a revolution that had started in October of 1934 with the Asturias Uprising. That argument, that they were simply trying to put down a communist revolution, would be one they continued to use throughout the war and the post-war era. In areas where the uprising failed and the Republicans kept hold, mobs of communist and anarchist militias ruled the streets, setting up their own revolutionary committees. They likewise murdered propertied elites, members of the church, and politicians who were conservative. They also burned down churches. So, who had the upper hand in July of 1936 when the war began? Well, let's look at the basic facts. Republican Spain controlled all of the major industrial and financial centers of Spain, and about 13 million people lived in Republican Spain, compared to 11 million in nationalist Spain. However, the nationalists controlled more of the farmland. That was very good farmland. On paper, the two sides had roughly the same size military forces at the beginning, if you took into account the fact that the Republic had the civil guard and police forces as well as loyal military units. However, in reality, they had a lot of officers who had remained loyal but had a hard time keeping troops. Many of them were conscripted and simply deserted when it seemed like things were going to be too troublesome or bloody. By contrast, the rebel units in Morocco and elsewhere were battle-hardened veterans with experience and training. In terms of war material, the Spanish Air Force was small, with the Republicans having around 200 planes and Nationalists having 100. Most were reconnaissance planes and some assorted fighters. The government had the majority of the Navy and 2/3 of all merchant shipping. They also controlled the arms factories. Overall, while the Republicans had more advantages materially, they also lacked a cohesive ideology and spirit, instead being made up of a disparate group of anarchist, communist, and advocates of regional independence. Some, like the radical anarchist, would even refuse orders from commanders at time and tended to naturally distrust leadership. On the other side, the nationalists had more advantages in terms of experience and training, but lacked materials. Both sides would look abroad for help to gain the upper hand and tip the scales in their favor.